Your pastor used to work at summer camps. And so every once in a while, we have to do one of those fun kind of summer camp songs that are a praise song and reminds us of so many fun times and even spiritually growing times in our lives at summer camp. How many of you went to summer camp as a kid? Anybody? Summer camp is so fun. Anybody work at summer camp? Some summer camp staff out there? A couple? Oh, I spent 3 years working at Pine Springs Ranch in Southern California and loved every minute of it. So much fun. We have a great camp here too, Glacier View Ranch. And I know my kids love going to Glacier View Ranch. We've been going through a series on Joseph the last couple of weeks, and we're wrapping up that series today, our last study on the book of Joseph, or on the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis. And Joseph's story is so inspiring on so many different levels. I think we could probably spend 3 or 4 months looking at the story of Joseph and gleaning insight as to how we can live a more faithful and trusting life. What an inspiration this story is. It's tough going through rough times in life if you feel like there's no reason. If there's a reason for it, you feel like, okay, I can do this. Here's a fun fact you may not have known. Your pastor used to be a lifeguard. Do we have any other lifeguards out there? Several other lifeguards. I see a couple. I know Rachel's a lifeguard. We've got several lifeguards in here. Lifeguard training can be kind of rough. You have to swim and swim and swim so many laps. When I was doing it, you were timed, so there was in the back of your head, all right, I got to do this many lap or this lap in this amount of time. There's rescue techniques that you have to learn. One of the more interesting and kind of entertaining rescue techniques that they taught us was specifically for rescuing a man. And when someone's drowning, you want to come up and approach them from behind, and you come over their shoulder and put your hand kind of under their armpit, and you do a side stroke back, and you have them kind of on your hip. And oftentimes, drowning victims will try and, not on purpose, but fight you to try and get up and to breathe, right? And can push the lifeguard down. And so our lifeguard instructor said, if you're rescuing a man, and you've got your arm over his shoulder and your hand in their armpit, if they fight you, just grab a handful of armpit hair and pull it as hard as you can, and they will stop fighting you immediately. And you had to learn all this stuff. We had to tread water with a 10-pound brick above our heads for 10 minutes. And as you're treading water with just your feet, and you kind of, if you put your head back, it's a little bit easier, but you have your hands above your head, treading water with just your feet, and it's hard and demanding, and you're trying not to sink, and you're thinking, okay, I'm going through this, but there's a purpose because I'm learning how to save somebody's life. All the swimming back and forth a million times. I've got to have the endurance if I've got to go out and do a rescue. All the practice with a partner who's going completely limp, trying to get them from the water up onto the side by yourself, if you have to, putting their hands up, getting out, dragging them, make sure you don't hit their head on the ground. There's all these different things that you have to do, but as you're going through them, and they're tough, you remember there's a purpose to all this. My brother was a lifeguard too, and his training, he did it several years before I did. His training was a little bit more aggressive than mine. I didn't have to do this, luckily. I remember watching him. He was 16, so I was maybe 12. And it was at a pool in San Marcos, California, and it was their deep diving pool, so it was about 11, 12 feet deep. And their class had to tread water in a circle with their eyes closed. And they had 2 very large, strapping lifeguards that would swim around them, and at any given moment would take them and go straight to the bottom of the pool as if they were a drowning victim trying to get up. And they would have to break the headlock that they were in, and if they couldn't, they'd pinch them, and then they'd let them go up and they'd come up. But pretty terrifying to be in there and pretty scary to watch too. I was like, what in the world? And these people just straight down. But there was all a purpose to everything tough that we went through training to be a lifeguard. There was a purpose for the struggle that we were going through. When we go through struggles in life and there doesn't seem to be any purpose, it's that much harder to make it through that struggle. If you're going through a tough time and you think, I don't know why this is happening to me, It's way harder than going through something and saying, I know there's a purpose, this is going to be good in the end, I'm going to make it, and this is going to be a good reason to make it. Two totally different ways of looking at struggles and handling struggles. So much harder when you can't see a purpose for the struggle that you're going through. Joseph went through so many different struggles. And he wouldn't have been human unless at several points he would ask, why am I going through this? Why is this happening to me? Has that question ever crossed your mind? In the middle of a valley, when something is happening in your life, have you ever asked, why is this happening to me? It's hard, isn't it? It's hard to go through struggles and trials in life when you're not sure why you're going through it. Joseph spends 10 years as a slave. He's falsely accused and spends 3 years in prison. And his attitude is amazing through all of this. Like we talked about last week, as he was going through it, he was doing his very best as a slave. I don't know if my attitude would be that good. All right, I'm a slave. I was taken away. I was sold. I guess I should do my very best as a slave. Who says that? And then he's falsely accused and he's thrown in jail. And he's in jail and he says, I guess I better do my very best in jail. And soon he's in charge of the whole jail. And his attitude is not one of self-pity, but looking out for who he can encourage. He goes by those two guys' cell and he says, hey, I noticed that you guys are looking sad today. What's going on? He's like the prison therapist. He goes to the cells, how are you feeling today? I see you're looking a little upset. You want to talk about it? What prisoners do that? I've watched the documentaries on prisons. Nobody's doing that in our prisons today. But Joseph determined in his mind that no matter what he was going to do, he was going to do his very best. And then as we finished off last week, Pharaoh has a couple of dreams. Joseph is called in. He interprets the dreams with the power of God. It's not Joseph. And Joseph is very clear. He says, God will tell me what's going on here. And he gives Pharaoh some advice. Here's what you need to do. And Pharaoh says, man, this kid's sharp. And he makes him the second most powerful human being on the planet. And gives him free reign over the whole country. Gives him the signet ring, which is basically like Pharaoh's signature. And he says, whatever Joseph says to do, that's what you're supposed to do. He goes from slave to prisoner to the second most powerful person on the planet. In the most powerful country on the planet at that time. And it's interesting that through all of these things, God was preparing Joseph for something bigger than he could even imagine. Now, he had those dreams as a 17-year-old boy about his family. But I don't think even he could imagine what God had in store for him and how God was training him to lead and to save so many people. So he starts work at the age of 30 as Pharaoh's right-hand man. 30 years old. And remember, according to Pharaoh's dreams, and where did Pharaoh's dreams come from, by the way? Those came from God. According to God's dreams that he gave to Pharaoh, there was going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of enormous famine. And so Joseph was to get as much food stored so that they would have meals during the famine for 7 years is a long time. How old will you be in 7 years? Imagine a famine from now until you're 7 years older than you are right now. That's a big deal. That's something you really have to prepare for. Joseph starts work. There's a quote that I mentioned in a sermon maybe 3 or 4 months ago that very well speaks what must have been Joseph's mindset going through all of this before he became Pharaoh's right-hand man. And it says this, I am going to judge my circumstances by Jesus' love, not Jesus' love by my circumstance. I love that because sometimes when we go through tough situations, we are tempted to believe that God does not care for us or love us or even know we exist anymore. That temptation is a very real temptation. And yet, I love this quote, I'm going to judge my circumstances by Jesus' love, not Jesus' love by my circumstance. No matter what it is we go through, Jesus always loves us. Another quote, I love this quote. You've heard me mention this probably before too. Don't tell God how big your problems are. Tell your problems how big your God is. I love that quote because it's full of trust and faithfulness. And Joseph, his faith didn't waver. So here he is, 30 years. He's working hard, and a lot happens in those 30 years. In Genesis chapter 41, we'll start in verse 46. It says, Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Now in the 7 plentiful years, the ground brought forth abundantly. So he gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt and laid up the food in the cities. He laid up in every city the food of the fields which surrounded them. Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. There was so much food, they just, instead of saying quantifying it and saying how much food they have, they just said, look, we've got a lot of food. We've quit counting, there's so much food. And in verse 50 it says, to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came. So in those 7 years, Joseph has a family. Remember when he got promoted from being jailer to second in command, the job came with a wife. It's kind of an unusual job perk, isn't it? Congratulations, you've gotten the promotion, and we've gotten you a wife as well. And it complicates the family because Joseph is a follower of God. And does anybody know what his father-in-law did for a living? He was a pagan priest. And a very important pagan priest. There's a lot of P's in that sentence. Very important pagan priest. That's his father-in-law. Very complicated family. Can you imagine Joseph and his wife having conversations, getting to know each other? So how did you come to Egypt? It's a long story. Tell me about your family. That's also a long story. He had to fill her in on all of this. They have 2 kids together. He becomes a father. And the names he chooses for his father, in verse 51, it says, Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made me forget all of my toil and all my father's house. You can tell that even though it's been almost 20 years at this point, that Joseph still deals with a lot of heartache, that there's a lot of hurt in his soul over all of this, just by how he names his kids. In verse 52, it says, the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. It says, then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph had said. The famine was in all the lands, but in the land of Egypt there was bread. Can you imagine Joseph's status in Egypt? As after 7 years, just like he said, the plenty was done and the famine began. I bet you people listened when Joseph talked. And I bet when Joseph talked about his God, people listened as well. And even though he calls it the land of his affliction, Joseph is a shining light as a follower of God in the land of his affliction. He still talks about God. He still refers to God as the one who gives him wisdom. Isn't it cool that he's a witness even in this nasty, terrible situation? Now, I've often wondered this. If I were Joseph and I became the second most powerful man on earth, would I want to take a caravan and just kind of breeze by my old neighborhood? I mean, how nice would that feel to have a caravan, like a caravan, the best caravan they've ever seen in that part of the world, because you can, and roll back into the old neighborhood. Hey guys, I'm back. He could have totally done that. Clearly, he still thinks about them all the time. And for 7 years, when he could have, he doesn't. And I wonder if when the famine started, clearly he's seeing everybody that comes in for food from out of town. He's got to be kind of looking for his brothers, don't you think? Just scanning the crowd and saying, I wonder if they'll come today. And the next day, I wonder if I'll see my brothers. And he would have had to have had a little bit of butterflies in his stomach every day when he looks out at the crowd, right? These are the same guys that sold him as a slave. How does he handle this interaction when it happens? And it's going to happen. Sure enough, verse 55, it says, so when the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said to the Egyptians, go to Joseph. Whatever he says, you do. And the famine was all over the face of the earth, and Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold them to the Egyptians. This is a brilliant business plan, by the way. He's selling them back their own food. Maybe the food they collected was taxed food or something like that. That was their tax. But this is a really good fundraiser for the country of Egypt. It's a monopoly. So all the countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain because the famine was severe in all the land. Chapter 42, verse 1, it says, when Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, Jacob said to his sons, why do you look at one another? This is kind of funny if you really stop and think about how he said this. Why are you guys just standing here looking at each other? Go get some grain. We're hungry. Stop just standing around looking at each other. Go to Egypt and get some food. Oh, well, okay. So the brothers make the journey to Egypt. And in verse 6 it says, now Joseph was governor over all the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down before him with their faces down to the earth. And Joseph saw his brothers, and he recognized them. This is the day he's been thinking about for 20 years. 2 decades. He's been thinking about this moment. Early on, not sure if it would ever happen. Later on, pretty sure it was going to happen. And what do his brothers do in front of him? The Bible says they bowed down with their faces to the earth. And here is Joseph, and he's like, I had a dream about this one time. In fact, I had 2 dreams. All of this stuff is coming full circle. Everybody's having dreams in this story. Did you notice this, by the way? God is communicating with multiple different people over multiple time periods through dreams. And Joseph sees the fulfillment of this dream right in front of him. His brothers bow down low to the earth. I wonder if Joseph said a prayer at that moment. God, I remember this. I've seen this before. This is what you had in mind. So Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. He must have wondered, do you think they'll recognize me? He does not look like the Joseph that they last saw. First of all, he was 17. Now he's 37, 38-ish, right around there. I'm sure they came around the first year of the famine early on. He looks like an Egyptian. When you become a part of Egyptian culture, they dress you like an Egyptian. You look like an Egyptian. When Moses went out to Midian, he's referenced, they said, this Egyptian was here. He looks like an Egyptian. He talks like an Egyptian. He walks like an Egyptian. Isn't that a song? I couldn't help myself, sorry. And here, Joseph looks like an Egyptian. He's speaking Egyptian. they don't know who he is. Verse 9, and Joseph remembered the dreams which he had dreamed about them and said to them, you are spies. That's an interesting thing for him to say, isn't it? I don't think he came up with that idea on the spot. I think he's been thinking about this for quite some time. What do I say to my brothers when I see him again? He couldn't follow them on Facebook and stalk them and see how they'd been. Have they changed a little bit? I don't know. Let's look them up on Google and see what they've been doing. Do they have a LinkedIn account we can check and see how they're doing? There's no way for him to know what his brothers are like 20 years later. No way. But he needs to know what his brothers are like now. So he has planned a test to see what his brothers are like. And he immediately accuses them of being spies to come and see the nakedness of the land, he says. Now, this is not the welcome that his brothers were anticipating. They were there to get food, take it back to their big families, I presume by now, and their father. Never did they think they would be accused of being spies. They're shepherds. What kind of shepherds really turn into spies? He tests them. Throws them in jail for 3 days. I wonder what it was like in jail with these 10 brothers, Benjamin's not with them, sitting in jail. Now, their connection to Egypt is clear. That's where they sold their brother off to. They presume he's probably dead by now. And a lot of their conversation in jail has to be about evil being repaid for evil done. This is happening because we did this. They're in jail for 3 days. Finally, Joseph says, listen, he starts realizing, hey, their families need food. My dad needs food. I can't keep him in jail forever. So he says to him, he brings him back in and he says this, all right, I'm going to send you back home with food, but I'm going to keep one of you here. You said you have an extra brother. If you want to see this brother again, and if you ever want to have food again, next time you come, bring your youngest brother. And then I'll know that you're not lying. They know this is not going to happen. It's not going to be well, but they don't have a choice. And Joseph says, I'm going to keep you. You're going to stay in jail until your brothers come back and bring your youngest brother back. And he picks Simeon. Now, if we rewind in the story, who was the ringleader who hated him a lot and was the idea, who brought the idea to sell him as a slave? Anybody remember his name? Simeon. Now, Joseph handles all this very, very well, but Joseph is a younger brother. And I think a little bit of that still stings for Joseph, even though he knows why he's there and who really sent him there. There's no way he doesn't remember the viciousness of how Simeon spoke to him and how much Simeon hated him. He says, we're going to keep this one. Take him to jail. And off Simeon goes to jail. The rest of them go home with all the grain. But Joseph has them take their money. Well, he has his people take their money and hide them back in the sacks. And then he sends them off. They get back and they find all their money in their sacks. And they're like, they're going to think we stole this. We can't go back now. We're in so much trouble. They think we're spies, first of all, but now it looks like we stole all our money back. And we're supposed to bring Benjamin back. Dad's never going to let us bring Benjamin back. There's no way. But the famine keeps on going. This has to be early on in the famine. And they tell their dad what happened. He's like, Benjamin's not going. There's no way I'm letting you take Benjamin back. What if something happens to him? He's the only child I have left from his mother. Food starts getting scarce. Kids start going hungry. And his 10 sons say, Dad, we've got to take him back. Or his 9 sons say, Dad, we've got to take him back and go. We're going to starve. Our kids are going to starve. Finally, he lets them take Benjamin. They go back with Benjamin. And in chapter 43, verse 15, it says, so the men took that present. Jacob sent a present with them. They take Benjamin, and they take double their money in their hand, and arose and went down to Egypt, and they stood before Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of the house, "Take these men to my home and slaughter an animal and make ready, for these men will dine with me at noon." Then the man did as Joseph ordered, and the man brought the men to Joseph's house. Now the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house, and they said, "It is because of the money which was returned in our sacks the first time that we are brought in, so that they may take the case against us, seize us, and make us slaves with our donkeys." Verse 19, so they drew near to the steward of Joseph's house and talked with him at the door of the house and said, "Oh, sir, we indeed came down the first time to buy food, but it happened when we came back to the encampment, we opened our sacks, and there was each man's money in the mouth of his sack, our money in full weight. So we have brought it back in our hand, and we have brought down other money to pay for the food that we'll take back." But the steward said in verse 23, "Peace be with you. Don't be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has given you treasure in your sacks. I have your money." And then he brought Simeon out to them. And this is such a weird situation for these guys. The steward says, "No, I'm totally full and paid. Your God must have put that money in your sacks. I don't need any more money from you." What? What is going on? The brothers must be totally confused. Verse 26, and Joseph came home. They brought him the present which their father had and put it in his hand, and they bowed down before him to the earth. And he asked them about their well-being and said, "Is your father well, the old man of whom you spoke? Is he still alive?" And they answered, "Your servant, our father, is in good health, and he is still alive." Joseph must have thought, I'm going to get to see my dad. After 20 years plus, his dad's in good health. He probably wondered many times if he would ever see his dad again. He lifted his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, "Is this your younger brother of whom you spoke to me?" And he said, "God be gracious to you, my son." Now his heart yearned, verse 30, his heart yearned for his brother. So Joseph made haste and sought somewhere to weep. And he went to his chamber and he cried there. This is such a gut-wrenching scenario for Joseph. His former life is coming back, and he's struggling with how to deal with this. So many emotions are coming. He's just in his chambers, sobbing. Verse 31, he washed his face and came out and restrained himself and said, "Serve the bread." So they set him a place by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat food with the Hebrews, for it was an abomination to the Egyptians. And they sat before them, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth, and the men looked in astonishment at one another. So many weird things happening in the story, and they are seated in the order of their age. Who on earth would know that? They must be sitting there looking at it, and I would have loved to see the first one who noticed it. They're sitting down and they're like, "Wait a second. How? What is going on? What is going on?" Benjamin gets a lot of extra stuff, 5 times as much stuff, and he was just watching them to see what they would do. He tests them again. He sends them off with food, and he hides a very special cup in Benjamin's sack. And he sends them off. They go, and Joseph sends his steward running after them. They're just outside of town. And his steward, the real friendly guy who's like, no, you're fully paid, no problem. The same steward is not very happy now, and he accuses them of stealing Joseph's cup. He says, "Why, after he's been so nice to you, why would you do this and repay evil for good when he's been good to you? You stole his cup." If they don't have gray hair by now, I don't know what it takes. They're like, "No, we didn't steal anything." And they're so bold, they say, "If you find the cup in one of our bags, you can kill the person who has the cup and is the thief." Let's look. So they start going through the bags. No cup, no cup. Come down to Benjamin's sack. They root through and they pick up Joseph's cup out of the sack. It's Benjamin's sack. And all the other brothers' hearts just sink to the floor. how can we let this happen to him? Our dad, his heart will break. What do we do? Poor Benjamin's like, I didn't do it. I don't know how this got there. Do the brothers believe him? Who knows? But poor Benjamin, I feel bad for the guy in this situation. He's like, I swear I didn't take the cup. It's in your bag. I don't know how it got there. And Judah, another brother who was instrumental in selling Joseph off with Simeon. Judah comes up and says, look, you can't take him. Take me instead, and I'll be your slave. Let him go. I'll take his place. It would break my father's heart if you took him. Imagine Benjamin in this whole thing. His brother coming and sticking up and offering to take his place. Judah says, I'll take his place. He's offering to never see his wife and kids again. Ever. To live the life of a slave voluntarily. Joseph tests them and tests them. And in chapter 45, it says, Joseph could not restrain himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, make everyone go out from me. And it's just he and his brothers back in Egypt. And there they are wondering what in the world is going on. All of his helpers are gone. It's just Joseph and his 11 brothers. Confusion. What have we done now? Joseph, ready to burst. In verse 2, it says he started crying out loud. He wept out loud. So loud that the Egyptians in the house of Pharaoh heard it. A gut-wrenching crying session. Verse 3, and Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph, does my father still live? But his brothers could not answer them, for they were dismayed in his presence. Imagine the look on Joseph's brothers' faces when he says, I am Joseph. Surprise, I speak your language. I've been listening in this whole time. I'm your brother Joseph. And Joseph, verse 4, says to his brothers, please come near me. And so they came near. And he said again, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Whew. What a heavy moment. The brothers' faces must just be like what would your face be if you were one of those brothers? But here's what Joseph said, and I love how he processes this and explains this to his brother, which shows us how he has dealt with so many problems, sometimes unexplainable in his life. Listen to how he explains his last 22 years at this point. Verse 5, but now do not therefore be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. So at some point, Joseph looked at all the trials that he'd been through, which were many, and he realized that God was using those things for good. He may not have always realized that in the middle of what he was going through, but he remembered those promises, those dreams even, that God had sent him, and he realized that there was a bigger purpose than everything he could see right now in his bubble at this time. And he says to them, it wasn't you who sent me, but God sent me here to preserve life. And in verse 6, he says, for these 2 years the famine has been in the land. There are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing or harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve a posterity for you in the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God. Wow. Can you imagine being in the room when he explains this? What do the brothers think of? Because the brothers have changed, clearly. What had to happen in Joseph's heart to go from the point of saying, why is this happening to me? To trusting in God, to realize that He turns rough things into good things. And to say, I'm going to trust God even though I can't understand why I'm going through this right now. That God has something bigger in mind that will be a bigger blessing than I can see right now. But in this, I'm going to trust that God will turn this terrible situation into something good. We may not always understand why things happen to us in our lives. We may have questions. Why did my spouse have to die? Why did I lose so much in my investments? Why did my business fail? Why didn't I get the promotion I wanted so badly? Why am I having marriage problems? Why aren't my kids in the church? Why do I have cancer or diabetes or high blood pressure or seizures or food allergies? Why are these things happening to me? We may have questions. And we may not be able to see the purpose in everything in this life. But one thing that you can count on is that God has been with you. He has been faithful. And there's no doubt in my mind that in your story, God will take all of the heartache that you have dealt with in your life, and one day He will show you how He was able to use it in a way that you may not have seen to do good. And one day it will make sense and you will be content with God's answers to your questions. No matter what we struggle with here, God is with us. Adam struggled. God was with him. Eve struggled. God was with her. David struggled. God was with him. Mary Magdalene struggled, but God was with her. Peter struggled. God was with him. Moses struggled. God was with him. Paul and Silas struggled. God was with them. Noah struggled. God was with him. Job struggled, and God was with him. And Joseph struggled, and God was with him. There's a man who lived quite a while ago in communist China. And even still today, it's very difficult to be a person of faith in China, but it was even harder a while back. And there was a man, there's a book of his story called The Man Who Couldn't Be Killed. His name was Mr. Wong. I read this story when I was a kid. I love this story. An incredible story. He was arrested because he wouldn't renounce his faith in Jesus. He wouldn't give up his faith. He was beaten senseless. There's many parts of his story. There's a whole book worth. I'll just focus on a few points here of his story. He was beaten so senseless that they took him out and threw him on a pile of dead bodies thinking he was dead and left him there. He woke up later, got up and walked back into camp. And everybody, the soldiers in the camp were like, what is this guy? We thought he was dead. Nope. He was alive, came right back into camp. Another time, and the beatings were regular, but another time they took him and were going to slowly kill him by tying him to a post in the wintertime, removing all of his clothes, tying him to the post and leaving him there all night long. A terrible way to die. So there's Mr. Wong, hands tied around a post. It's going to be very, very cold, well below freezing that night. He's got no clothes on. Everybody leaves and goes to bed, and there he is by himself. He feels the rope being loosened behind him. He looks behind him, there's no one there. But the rope is physically loosened. He gets his hands out, and boy, it's cold. So he starts running. He starts exercising. All night long, he exercises and stays warm and stays alive. And then he says, boy, I'm going to be in trouble if they see I'm untied here in the morning. I better get back over to the post. So he goes back over to the post and puts his hands back there, and the rope is tightened behind him. And the soldiers come out, and there he is alive. And they're like, how in the world? Over and over they tried to kill this guy. Over and over they tried to break this man's faith, repeatedly beating him senseless. And in those moments, he must have wondered, what good is this doing? Why is this happening to me? This isn't fair at all. There's no point to this. But he never strayed away from his faith. He never broke. Made it out, survived, found his wife, And his story is an inspiration to many, many people today of how to keep your faith despite having everything thrown at you. All of God's people from the beginning have struggled at some point in their lives, including you and me. And just like with them, God has been with us all of our lives and has helped us to overcome our struggles and will help us to overcome our struggles in the future. There's two quotes I want to read to you from the pen of Ellen White. And the first one comes from the Ministry of Healing, page 473 and 74. In the future life, the mysteries that here have annoyed and disappointed us will be made plain. We shall see that our seemingly unanswered prayers and disappointed hopes have been among our greatest blessings. It's hard to imagine that when we're going through disappointment, isn't it? But someday God will make things clear, and as we look back, we will see that those have been some of our biggest blessings. Testimonies for the Church, Volume 9. All that has perplexed us in the providences of God will in the world to come be made plain. The things hard to be understood will then find explanation. The mysteries of grace will unfold before us. Where our finite minds discovered only confusion and broken promises, we shall see the most perfect and beautiful harmony. We shall know that infinite love ordered the experiences that seemed most trying. As we realize the tender care of Him who makes all things work together for our good, we shall rejoice with joy unspeakable and full of glory. No matter what happens to us, God is always with us, taking our situation and turning it into something good. We may not see it for a long time, but we all know we serve a good God who is a master at turning a curse into a blessing. Trust Him with your struggles. Never lose faith in your Creator, even in your storms. And no matter how big your storm is, He is a God who is master of the storm. I'm going to invite our worship team to come up. We're going to close with a song. And this song is very appropriate for the story of Joseph. The song is called "Great is Thy Faithfulness." And the words to this song, it talks